All right, good morning, everybody. I've got just a few minutes after 11, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for joining in this morning for our April installment for the webinar series, Understanding Our Wildlife. So with that, I want to thank Cindy Simpson for agreeing to give this April webinar. Cindy is our Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator in our Habitat Conservation Division, and her presentation today is NC's Wildlife Action Plan supports conservation through science, evaluating conservation status of species. So with that, Cindy, I'll let you share your screen and go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you, David, and thank you for everybody that's joining us this morning. As David said, I'm Cindy Simpson, and I'm the Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator. I've been with the agency for a little over 10 years, about 10 and a half years, and I work in the Raleigh office. So what I'm going to talk about today is really just one aspect of using science in the Wildlife Action Plan. So I'm also going to briefly give you an overview of what the action plan is in case some of you are not familiar with it. Then I'm going to describe the science in our process to identify species of greatest conservation need, which is specific to our plan. And then I'll talk a little bit about next steps as we start revision of our Wildlife Action Plan. So you're all probably familiar with the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act of 1937, more commonly known as Pittman-Robertson Act. It was the first national effort toward funding wildlife conservation, and PR funds are financed through purchases of sporting firearms, ammunition, and archery equipment. So it can be variable. I think right now it's back on the upswing. Now, this funding model was later expanded to include sport fish with passage of the Federal Aid and Sports Fish Restoration Act, commonly known as Dingell-Johnson, or DJ. So even though PR and DJ funds are for game species, their use in North Carolina has often benefited non-game species through conservation activities such as land acquisitions and habitat management. Well, these programs are managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In the early 1990s, a coalition of conservationists and state agency wildlife professionals recognized the need for dedicated funding for conservation of non-game species. So AFWA formed the Teaming with Wildlife Coalition, and they successfully led efforts to secure designated federal funds for non-game species conservation. So to keep them from becoming more endangered and needing to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. Well, their efforts led to creation of the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program, which we refer to as SWIG, which was signed into law in 2002. The SWIG program is part of a national effort by state wildlife agencies to identify conservation needs and implement priority actions that benefit non-game fish and wildlife and their habitats. SWIG funds are provided through annual federal budget cycles. So there's not a specific set amount of money. It's whatever Congress decides to set aside. They're matching grant dollars, so there is a state portion that has to be applied, and it's apportioned through to the states through a formula. Part of that is the land mass, so how many square acres, square kilometers that we have, and then the population. So the census is very important. So like PR and DJ funded programs, the SWIG program is also managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Well, the very first wildlife action plans were published back in 2005. And at that time, there was very little guidance on what should be addressed. So every state plan was variable. It had differing levels of detail and types of information. So in 2007, as a measure to make regional planning easier by having similar information addressed by all of the states, Fish and Wildlife Service published guidance that had 8 required elements they wanted all plans to include. And elements 1 through 5 focused on wildlife species or species of greatest conservation need by addressing their conservation needs, understanding condition of their habitats, identifying threats, and recommending priority actions to address the concerns. Elements 6 through 8 focused on working with partners and the public to develop and implement the plan and on mandatory revision requirements. Well, the primary requirement is and always has been this list of species of greatest conservation need, or I'll probably say SGCN a lot. So you may be wondering, how does WRC identify and create an SGCN list? So our first SGCN list was developed using a newly created formal ranking process that considered past and current measures taken for management and conservation of species. The evaluation process used species experts working on taxa teams to complete individual evaluations of non-game wildlife in the state. Well, most criteria were ranked as either high, medium, or low, or simply a yes or no statement. So even though this first plan from 2005 was a very strong foundation for our conservation efforts for non-game species, after the process was over, many taxa team members recognized that the evaluation method was widely interpretive. How do you know what's high, medium, low? Or what happens if yes and no are not always the best answer? That it was hard to consistently measure, and then it was difficult for others to replicate. So as you may know, in a scientific process, replication is key for having a strong process. So team member comments called for the method to be strengthened and improved in terms of objectivity, clarity, and standards. So the taxa team members were not the only ones calling for strengthening and creating a method for designating SGCN. In the mid-2012, as we were here at WRC getting organized to start our 10-year revision, an AFWA work group published voluntary best practice guidance for states to use during the revision of their plans. And the AFWA guidance includes numerous recommendations, and there were many of them that we implemented, and most were related to use of defined procedures for assessing conservation status and setting conservation priorities. So one of the recommendations is to use a formal ranking method to evaluate wildlife. And so this supported our decision to create a new evaluation system. And another recommendation was to use standard language for describing threats. And this recommendation suggests this followed a system that was outlined in a paper published by Slawski and others. So working from the 2005 taxa team set of recommendations to improve our process and the 2012 best practice guidance, we set goals for ranking all species in the state, both game and non-game, to measure more than just conservation status. So we wanted the evaluation to include a quantitative method that uses numerical answer scales instead of subjective assessments. We wanted a process that could be replicated more easily by different reviewers and during future updates. We wanted metrics and answer scales that created a more comprehensive picture of wildlife in the state. And we wanted to be able to generate scores that could be used in ranking species for priority conservation. So as a first step in developing a new process, I reviewed a number of published peer-reviewed literature to compare various evaluation systems and methods and tools. And I narrowed the considerations down to a few that I felt were particularly strong and would be applicable in our state. I convened a work group of WRC biologists to help me evaluate these methods and to develop an evaluation system for use in our 2015 action plan revision. Well, the work group considered the applicability and strength of the plans, the tools and the methods that you see listed here. And so the work group decided that we wanted to use the evaluation system developed by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Agency. It's often referred to as MILSAP paper. And this method was published back in 1990 in the Wildlife Society's peer-reviewed journal, Wildlife Monographs. And I'm sure David is familiar with this one since he used to work at Florida Fish and Wildlife. We also wanted to use the method used in the NatureServe evaluation tool. And we used NatureServe's tool because it's a very strong method and because our Natural Heritage Program uses their tool for species they track. North Carolina's Natural Heritage Program is part of the National NatureServe organization, meaning that our NHP data is part of a larger national database that's publicly available. So anything that we can contribute benefits a much broader constituency than just North Carolina. And it also means that data from other states can be more easily compared because it's all in this standard format. And then we wanted to adopt the standard language for threat classifications that was outlined by Solavsky's paper, and it was published in a peer-reviewed journal back in 2008. So next I'm going to show you what some of these look like so that you'll recognize them when I show you what we've done. Well, the first one was the Florida Fish and Wildlife evaluation method. They used 3 categories in their evaluations: biological variables about population, range, and trends, action variables about levels of knowledge, and supplemental variables about other concerns. So as you can see in the details for that first question about population size, their response metrics use a range of numeric responses that were assigned an actual ranking score. And we used this method as a model because the questions were specific to wildlife populations in the state. It used a quantitative metric, and the results had been statistically evaluated and found to be robust. So that was one of the strengths of this particular method, was after they did their ranking, they actually did some statistical analysis and found that the method was very strong and correlated well with what they knew about species in the state. So I'm going to show you 2 examples from the NatureServe evaluation tool. They used a very similar structure as the Florida Fish and Wildlife method, using quantitative selections for measuring population size. And the work group decided to use very similar metrics, the numeric responses in our data, so that it could be more easily integrated into the Heritage Program's database. And then the second example shows their selection for measuring and considering long-term population trends, and long-term being things that happen more than just a decade or so ago. So this is really kind of an important consideration when you think about where red-cockaded woodpecker populations are. Historically, the use of longleaf pine for naval stores to create the tar for pitch and the timber for boat lumber is one of the reasons why our longleaf pine forests declined so much over the landscape, and that had a direct effect on red-cockaded woodpeckers. So long-term trends are very important to consider. The complexity of this NatureServe evaluation tool is one of the reasons that most states have elected not to use it for their SGCN evaluation. There's actually a number of different Excel spreadsheet worksheets that you have to fill out in order to get to a score. And so we felt that was kind of cumbersome. And then for the standard language for threats, this is an example from the Solavsky paper. So in this paper, they describe 11 different threat categories, and they explain what activities fit into each category. And so it's important, too, to consider that this threat category has been integrated into the IUCN Red List criteria, so it's used by other methods too. And this is a list of the 11 threats that and what actually makes up those threats. So we made one modification to this. We did incorporate the 11, but number 11 is different. One of Pulaski's threat categories is for geologic and volcanic activity, earthquakes and eruptions. And since these really don't represent a significant threat in North Carolina, we decided to increase our focus on disease and pathogens as its own topic, even though it's included in number 8, invasive and other problematic species and genes. So even though this paper was a great way to standardize our language about threats, it did not include any kind of evaluation metrics for measuring or ranking threats. And so the work group felt the best method would be to use NatureServe's evaluation metric here is a Bayesian inference analysis. It's shown by this table. And so in case you're wondering what a Bayesian inference analysis is and why the work group thought it would be the best evaluation method, I'll tell you. It's a statistical method based on Bayes' rule, which is a mathematical rule used to describe the probability of an event happening based on what you know about the conditions of that event. So another way to think about it is, what's the probability that development will create an impact to a species when we know that their habitat is in an area that will be developed? And so this method can be used because we decided to use this method because there's really not a lot of research available on threat topics, specifically about how they affect species in North Carolina. Well, the work group's final recommendation was to use an evaluation and ranking process divided into 3 categories: conservation concern, knowledge gaps, and management concerns. So this methodology uses a set of independent metrics. Each one has its own separate answer scale that corresponds to a set of scores. And all of these metrics are independent questions and are not compared to other metrics. Each answer scale is independent and uses its own graduated 10-point score range, where the maximum is 10 points and the minimum is 0. And then these 3 categories are totaled separately to develop a ranking score for each category. And the final scores can be variable depending on how many taxa team members respond and submit a response, and the range of different responses for each of the questions. And so the 2015 revision process followed the same taxa team structure with species experts from various agencies and organizations, WRC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Natural Heritage Program, some of our conservation partners like Audubon, North Carolina, the universities, just lots of people with an expertise for species. We had 8 different taxonomic teams, and so they each worked independent of each other, though I will say the amphibian and reptile team was combined and operated as a HERP team because it was the same exact team members and that participated on it. So just for logistics, it made sense for them to all work together. But amphibians were evaluated as a separate group from reptiles. And the ranking scores were not compared. And I want to point out that the teams were able to create and apply weighting factors if they felt that was necessary. And there were a couple of teams that actually did that. And as you can imagine, calculating scores can be very complex. And so in order to keep all the taxa team members focused on the metrics and not on score calculations, we used a PAWS database. I worked with WRC IT staff to develop an internal database that would record the individual team member responses and then calculate all of the scores and generate reports for each species in each taxa team. And so that's what this looks like in PAWS. And up at the top where it says project year 2018, that's from our mid-year update to our SGCN list. The original project year was 2013. So there's actually data from both evaluations in there. And then when we prepare and start for our next evaluation, there'll be another year added. So it is a great archive tool for keeping our data. So the results from the taxa team members, you know, like I said, they entered the data. We used the database to generate scores. And out of those scores, the taxa teams created their SGCN list. And so that SGCN list exists as an Excel spreadsheet. And we provided those that data and the spreadsheets as Appendix G in our Wildlife Action Plan. And they're all available for download to anybody who wants them from our Wildlife Action Plan website. And we have provided them to lots of other agencies. A couple of years ago through CAFWA, the Southeast AFWA organization, a regional SGCN list was created, and our WRC biologist that worked on the work group to develop that regional SGCN list was able to use our data from this evaluation to support that process. So next I'm gonna use just the conservation concern category to show you what the evaluation results look like. So this screen shows you a metric and answer scale list examining species range-wide. So we did this because there are a lot of species that have a range extending beyond North Carolina. Sometimes it's over long, long distances and even into international landscapes, such as migratory birds. And so as you can see in question number 3 about range size, North Carolina, for our state, we fall within that response for F in the list, which gets 4 points. And so that's even, you know, less than half of what's considered in range size. So I want to show you what the results look like for one of the taxa teams, and I'm going to use birds as my example for all of these. And so here's the example from the bird taxa team. This is what a part of the Excel spreadsheet looks like. And I want to look at northern saw-whet owl as my example. So metric 1 shows that it is a state listed as a threat. The species has that state listing status, and we provided that in the responses because that's regulatory. And so for that response, the species got 6 points. Next, I want to show you range-wide population estimates for metric number 2. So the response here is a G2H, which means that the taxa team felt that there were anywhere from 100,000 to over 1 million individuals found range-wide. And that's pretty common to have such a large range for a species that extends over a very large area. So northern saw-whet owls are found in western North Carolina's southern Appalachian Mountains. Our particular population, though, has been determined to be morphologically different than other northern saw-whet owls that are found in other parts of the U.S. and are genetically distinct from another subpopulation that's found in British Columbia up into Canada. So now we're going to look at conservation concern metrics for the status of a species specific to where it is in North Carolina. And that's the other half of the conservation concern metrics. So using that same example of the northern saw-whet owl, we're going to look at its population size in North Carolina, And you can see in the response metric that that is B to C, which gets a higher number of points. That's a much smaller population, anywhere from 50 to 1,000 individuals. And in metric 6, the range size, it's not listed as square kilometers or square acres. It's listed as number of counties. And so the very smaller population compared to the larger range-wide, but in North Carolina, the smaller population is spread out over a number of counties. So we used counties, and then for aquatic species, river basins, because that's how our Natural Heritage Program tracks species in their database, and how they list species in their biannual rare animals list that's used by a number of people in the state. And so we wanted to make sure we could integrate this with their data. And so as you can see, with these much smaller populations spread out over a larger area, North Carolina's population of northern saw-whet owls, being genetically distinct, have a higher conservation concern than maybe you would have thought. And so metric 9 is the last one in the conservation concern category. And this is how we measured threats or evaluated threats. This metric was structured into a Part A and a Part B response, one looking at the scope of the threat and the other one looking at the severity. And so this is how we applied it in the PAWS database and how it was reported in the Excel spreadsheets. And for a comparison here, I'm showing you that Bayesian inference chart, and we're going to use that northern saw-whet owl as an example again. So for invasive problematic species, looking at that particular response. So the saw-whet owl is a habitat specialist in North Carolina, restricted to very high elevation stands of red spruce, Fraser fir, and northern hardwoods. And under number 8, threat number 8, it was ranked pretty high and got 6 points, showing it's a medium threat for problematic species. And so what we know is that the taxa team's members considered the probability of the competitive pressures from the more common barred owl as being a problem for northern saw-whet owls, not only as a predator to the owl, but also competitive pressures for nesting and foraging. And so for the bird taxa team, they decided to use the single highest threat score from the 11 different categories as part of the scoring. And so that's where you see that 8 points were listed, because that was out of the 11 threats, 8 was the highest of the threat scores for that bird. And then they used a formula. This was a weighting factor to consider whether or not the populations are only breeding populations, non-breeding or wintering populations, or both that occur in the state. And so that was something unique that they did for their scoring. There are also evaluation results for the knowledge gap category and the management concern category that you'll find in those Excel files. Here you can see that the threat categories, those 11 threat categories, were ranked from low to high as its importance or priority for a research topic. And the color coding indicates how many different threats you can see that are of high importance or high priority as a research topic. So if you're interested in looking at any of the data, you'll find the rest of it in the Appendix G files from our website. And in 2020, we published a minor review of our list, and so the tables that are available include that update. So what's next? Our 10-year mandatory review is due to be submitted to Fish and Wildlife Service in 2025. So that's 4 years. Early planning activities are beginning this year. And so just like with previously, the revision process, in 2005, I talked with the tax team members after our 2005 plan was finished, and the consensus was that we should convene another work group in order to reevaluate our method and make sure that it is as strong as we think it is or can be. And so I'm planning later this year to convene another species evaluation criteria work group. It'll be made up of staff within the agency, and hopefully will be finished late 2021, maybe early 2022. And then one of the next steps would be to convene taxa teams comprised of WRC biologists, species experts from our various partners, and begin their process probably early 2022. And they'll have about a year or so to get finished. That's about how long it has taken us in the past, a little over a year, year and a half. I'll be requesting SGCN recommendations from experts on insects. We were not able to create a evaluation process for insects. That taxonomic group is just way too diverse, and there's way too few people who have expertise. So we just asked for recommendations, and that's what we have in our 2015 plan. And then new for 2025, I have already spoken with plant conservation professionals, and I'll be looking to receive a plant SGCN list recommendation. And that's because there may be some increased funding opportunities for them for conservation of rare plants. And so with that, I will be very happy to answer any question or take your comments if anybody has any.
All right, great. Thanks, Cindy. Great job. And I'll remind everybody, if you will, put any questions you have in the chat. I guess, Cindy, I'll ask one to start off with. So in your opinion, how, if at all, would passage of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act by Congress impact our wildlife action plan process?
That's a really great question, and I'm glad that you asked it. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA, looks to dedicate permanent funding for the state wildlife grants program. So right now we get an annual apportionment decided by Congress, and it can be any amount. It has gone through increases and decreases and increases and decreases. We get currently roughly $1.5 million for all of the aquatic and wildlife diversity programs. And so RAWA looks to take money out of the general fund that at one point it was going to be money coming from the leases that energy companies have to pay the federal government in order to extract energy from public lands, federal public lands. So your oil energy, your wind energy, solar energy that's on public lands, they pay a tax in order to, or a fee to, in order to use that. And so it generates a lot of money that goes into what's considered a general fund for the federal government. So they were originally looking at taking it out of that. I'm not sure that that's still the case, but they were going to set aside this permanent funding. So it wouldn't be decided annually. It would be this pot of money every year set aside, and it would be divided amongst the states and the tribes and the territories that qualify under this state wildlife grant program. And if that were the case, when it's passed, and I'll say when, not if, the North Carolina could get anywhere between $20 and $30 million. So when you compare that to 1.5, that's a significant increase in the amount of dedicated funding that we would get. So that opens an opportunity for not just WRC and the work that we do for conservation, but expanding our partnerships and what we're able to do through other organizations. It also, RAWA, as it's currently written, and since it's not a passed bill yet, it's subject to change, but as it was currently written, it expands our ability to use those funds toward outreach and education as it relates to wildlife and wildlife recreation. It expands the amount of money we can spend on law enforcement and enforcement activities that support conservation of SGCN species, and then also allows states to spend a percentage of their dollars toward rare plant conservation. And so just as it's currently written, that would provide an immense opportunity for North Carolina to expand our efforts, to support partner efforts, and to incorporate new research in what we do. So as I pointed out in that one slide, there are a lot of topics that need to be researched for how threats affect populations of species. There's some synergy there between, climate change and land development. As climate is changing on the coast, and as land development, everybody that owns land now at the beach, as those properties wash away and new beach area is created, there's going to be a movement of infrastructure and housing and everything else. So what's that going to do to species that are now in those coastal populations? How are they going to be able to move? Are they going to have habitat to go to? Those are really important research topics. So RAWA definitely would be a boon for us in order to address some of that.
Great, thanks. Also, I think you're still sharing your screen if you want to drop that.
Okay.
Anybody got any other questions for Cindy?
Well, yeah.
I'm not seeing any more, but I would certainly encourage everybody, if you have any questions about the Wildlife Action Plan or the Wildlife Action Planning process, or just want some additional information, I would really encourage everybody to reach out to Cindy.
And to keep your eyes open, because as I mentioned, we're at the beginning of that revision process in the planning portion of it. And so over the next couple of years, you're going to see various announcements come out about action plan related activities, whether it's some sort of meeting or a request for people to review information, and that'll be open to everybody. So I hope that you'll take the opportunity to at least look at whatever comes your way, and if you have the opportunity to participate, to do that too.
All right, very good. Well, again, thanks, Cindy. That was a great presentation. We all appreciate you doing that. And with that, I'll say, let me make sure. Yeah, you're getting lots of thanks in the chat and great information, great presentations in the chat. But with that, I'll say have a good day, and I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everybody.